My neighbor smiled and whispered she hadn't been touched in years, then reached for me. The first time I noticed her, she was standing by the edge of her balcony, sunlight brushing her hair like strands of gold. She moved with a quiet elegance, not the flashy kind that draws immediate attention, but a presence that made everything around her seem a little softer, a little warmer. I remember pausing at my own window, pretending to check my phone, just to watch her adjust a potted plant, her fingers grazing the leaves with a tenderness that made the air between us feel almost alive. She was around 40, maybe a little older, and there was something in the way she carried herself, confident yet unhurried, that hinted at experience and resilience. I could sense a life lived fully, yet with moments of solitude tucked quietly behind her composed exterior. There was a faint perfume that seemed to drift toward me when the wind caught her just right, floral but understated, like she didn't need to announce her presence. And yet, it drew me in. Our first interaction was accidental, almost trivial. I was hauling in a heavy grocery bag when she stepped out to retrieve hers from her car. Our eyes met for a fleeting second, and she smiled, not the kind of smile that lingers for attention, but one that felt intimate, like she had noticed me noticing her. It left a quiet echo in my chest, a small flutter that I couldn't explain. I began to see her in little moments that painted a larger picture. The way she hummed softly while watering her plants, a tune that seemed like it belonged more to memories than the present. The gentle tilt of her head as she read, sunlight catching the lines of her face in a way that made her appear both strong and vulnerable at once. Even the mundane things, like the way she sipped her coffee slowly on her balcony or tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, became oddly compelling to me. I realized I was curious about her life, her past, and the quiet loneliness I sensed beneath her composed exterior. The age difference wasn't a problem, if anything, it made me more aware of the depth in her presence, the stories her eyes hinted at, the laughter that didn't always reach her lips. I wanted to know her rhythm, the cadence of her day, the soft sighs that revealed the hidden corners of her heart. By the end of that first week, I found myself looking forward to these glimpses, these small moments of connection that didn't need words. And in those stolen observations, I felt the first stirrings of something that went beyond neighborly curiosity, a delicate, quiet pull towards someone who seemed just out of reach, yet already so intimately close. It started with something small, almost insignificant, a shared moment of inconvenience that somehow became unforgettable. She had dropped a bag of groceries on the stairwell, the crinkle of plastic echoing in the quiet building. I stepped forward instinctively, bending to help her gather the scattered contents. Our hands brushed briefly over a can of beans, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected warmth up my arm. For a second, it felt like time paused, the air thick with an unspoken recognition, a fragile curiosity neither of us dared name. Her fingers were soft, but there was a quiet strength to them, a steadiness that suggested someone used to carrying the weight of life with grace. When she smiled at me, it wasn't a casual neighborly grin, it lingered in a way that felt deliberate yet effortless. I noticed how her eyes caught the light, amber flecks that seemed to study me without judgment, as if she could see the small hesitations I usually hid. The faint floral scent from her hair mingled with the earthy aroma of the groceries, creating a memory I couldn't quite shake. We walked up the stairs together, our shoulders occasionally brushing. Each accidental touch, a brief hand grazing, the soft press of her bag against my arm, carried an electricity that neither of us acknowledged aloud. I was hyper-aware of her presence, the subtle warmth radiating from her, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed at something mundane, the way she adjusted her coat and unconsciously leaned closer as we moved. There was an intimacy in these small collisions, a slow rhythm of connection building in silence. When we finally reached her apartment, she paused at the door and turned to me. For a heartbeat, our hands hovered near each other, neither fully letting go nor fully holding on. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but tinged with a warmth that seemed to reach straight to my chest. There was a vulnerability in the way she looked at me, as if that brief touch had revealed more than either of us expected. Later, I caught myself replaying the moment in my mind, the brush of her fingers, the subtle electricity in the air, the way she smelled faintly of lavender and sunlight. That day, something shifted. I realized that attraction wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a quiet tension, a magnetic pull, a delicate awareness of someone who could be close yet still out of reach. And just like that, a single brush of hands had begun to unravel the careful distance we both tried to maintain, leaving a lingering question in the spaces between us: what would happen if we didn't let go? A few days after our small stairwell encounter, we found ourselves sharing a quiet moment on her balcony, the city below bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. She had invited me over for coffee under the pretense of thanking me again for helping with the groceries, but it was clear neither of us expected the conversation to stay casual. I noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the soft tension in her shoulders, and the way she kept her fingers wrapped loosely around her cup. There was a grace in her posture, but also an openness, a willingness to let someone in. She spoke softly, not with the arrogance of someone used to commanding attention, but with a kind of honest fatigue that made her real. I could feel it, the quiet weight of years lived fully, yet alone. "I haven't been touched in years," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the casual veil of conversation dropped. The words hung between us, fragile and raw, carrying the weight of loneliness she had carried in silence. I didn't move immediately, I just let the statement settle in, letting the quiet presence of her vulnerability fill the space. There was a strange intimacy in the pause that followed. I noticed the warmth of her hands around the coffee cup, the subtle tilt of her head toward me, the way her shoulders softened when she realized I wasn't recoiling or judging. There was trust in that silence, a shared acknowledgement that we were both treading carefully on a line between friendship and something more delicate, more charged. I found myself leaning slightly closer, not intentionally, just drawn to the quiet gravity of her presence. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, jasmine, earthy and comforting, mingling with the aroma of coffee and the faint tang of the late afternoon breeze. Every detail became magnified, the rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her gaze, the way the sunlight glinted off the delicate bracelet on her wrist. We spoke about life, about divorce, about the spaces in our hearts that had been left unfilled. And though we were careful with words, the emotional honesty of the conversation created a closeness neither of us had anticipated. The subtle brush of her hand against mine when she reached for her cup felt electric, yet tender, as if confirming that the distance we maintained was more a choice than necessity. By the end of that evening, something had shifted irrevocably. There was a shared understanding, a quiet intimacy that went beyond casual neighborly connection. The tension had deepened, but it was no longer just curiosity or attraction, it had become something more nuanced, a delicate longing, a slow-burn desire rooted in trust, vulnerability, and the subtle ache of loneliness finding a safe place. The next encounter wasn't planned, yet it felt inevitable. We ended up on her living room couch, ostensibly to watch a movie she had been recommending, though I suspect neither of us cared much about the film. The sunlight slanted through the curtains, soft and warm, casting a gentle glow across the room. I was hyper-aware of her presence beside me, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the gentle sway of her body as she shifted to get comfortable. We sat a little too close, our knees nearly brushing. I felt a subtle tension in the space between us, like a current of unspoken feelings vibrating in the air. When she laughed at a line in the movie, it wasn't just a sound, it was a warmth that seemed to press against my chest, drawing me in. Her hand brushed against mine accidentally when she reached for a blanket, a touch so light it could have been ignored, yet it sent a small thrill up my arm. I caught myself noticing the smallest details, the delicate curve of her wrist, the softness of her sweater against her skin, the way her shoulder angled slightly toward me as if inviting closeness without saying a word. There was a magnetic subtlety in every gesture. Even when she leaned back into the cushions, there was a gravity to her presence, a quiet invitation to linger near, to exist in that space together without pretense. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual, intimate in a way that made me lean in without realizing it. We didn't need to fill the room with words, the silence between us was comfortable, charged, and revealing all at once. Every shift of her body, every glance, every slight brush of her hand on mine became a dialogue of desire and trust. At one point, she adjusted a pillow behind her back, and our shoulders touched. Not dramatically, not intentionally, but it was enough. The warmth of her body radiated toward me in a way that felt grounding, safe, and quietly thrilling. I became aware of my own reactions, the subtle quickening of my pulse, the gentle warmth spreading across my chest, the way my focus had narrowed to her presence alone. By the end of the afternoon, the world outside seemed distant. The slow burn between us had intensified through these small, almost accidental touches, each one layering tension and curiosity. There was no rush, no overt declarations, just the shared understanding that closeness had a language all its own. And in that quiet proximity, the foundation of something deeper, something emotionally charged and delicately intimate, was quietly solidifying. The days that followed felt different, heavier, yet charged with something unspoken. I found myself thinking about her more than I realized, replaying moments of shared laughter, fleeting touches, and quiet glances. Each memory carried a warmth that made my chest tighten and my mind spin with questions I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. She had a way of lingering in thought, a quiet presence that made me simultaneously comforted and restless. Every interaction became a careful negotiation. When we met in the hallway or exchanged a smile over coffee, I felt an invisible pull, a magnetic tension I couldn't ignore. Her hand brushing mine while reaching for the sugar spoon, her shoulder lightly pressing against mine when we leaned over a recipe, each gesture was electric in its subtlety. And yet, I hesitated. I hesitated because the age difference, her life experience, and my own uncertainty whispered caution, reminding me that this wasn't just desire, it was also responsibility, sensitivity, and the need to honor the trust between us. At night, I replayed our conversations in my mind. I noticed the vulnerability in her voice when she spoke about her past, the faint tremor when she admitted moments of loneliness, the way her eyes softened when they lingered on me. I was drawn to her confidence, her quiet strength, and the tenderness that peeked through the composure she carried. But I was also painfully aware of my own hesitation, the fear of misreading signals, the worry of moving too fast, the internal debate between instinct and restraint. Yet the tension between us was undeniable. There were moments when our proximity made my pulse quicken, leaning slightly too close to hand her a cup of tea, her fingertips brushing my wrist while adjusting a blanket, the quiet warmth radiating from her presence when our knees accidentally touched. Each instance left a lingering heat, a reminder that the connection we were nurturing was more than casual. I couldn't ignore the emotions building beneath the surface. There was admiration, yes, but also a deep, quiet longing, an almost painful awareness of the desire to be near her, to comfort her, to be trusted by her in ways words couldn't capture. And yet, I held back, afraid that overt action might break the delicate intimacy we had created. It was in this conflict, in the constant push and pull of restraint and yearning, that the story of us truly began. The slow burn tension had reached its peak internally, desire tempered by hesitation, closeness shadowed by caution, and emotions deep enough to make each small interaction feel monumental. And in every fleeting touch, every lingering glance, the question hovered silently in the spaces between us: if we gave in to this pull, could we navigate it without losing the fragile trust we had built? The air between us felt different that evening, almost tangible, a quiet weight of something unspoken finally being recognized. We were sitting across from each other at her small kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the muted sounds of the city below filling the spaces between our words. The conversation began casually enough, about mundane things, a recipe she tried, a small story from her childhood, but slowly, the atmosphere shifted, becoming warmer, more intimate, charged with an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection we'd been nurturing. At one point, her hand brushed against mine as she reached for a mug of tea. It wasn't accidental, yet it wasn't deliberate in a way that demanded attention either. It was a quiet, gentle gesture, almost shy, but it spoke volumes. I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, a mix of comfort, desire, and relief. The subtle weight of her fingers against mine said more than words ever could: she trusted me, and I trusted her. She leaned slightly closer, and our shoulders touched, lightly, almost imperceptibly. The gesture was intimate without being bold, electric without being overwhelming. I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, the softness of her sweater against my arm, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Every detail heightened my awareness, the gentle tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It was a shared intimacy, a quiet understanding that we were no longer just neighbors or friends, but something delicately, beautifully more. The conversation deepened, moving toward the spaces we had kept guarded. She spoke about loneliness and the moments she'd spent wondering if companionship like this could exist again. I listened, offering small words of reassurance, letting the comfort of my presence say what I couldn't voice outright. And then, without forcing it, our hands found each other again, resting lightly on the table, fingertips touching, a gentle anchor in the sea of emotion between us. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no restraint holding back what had been quietly building. There was warmth, trust, and a subtle acknowledgement of desire, expressed not through grand gestures but through soft, lingering touches and quiet, honest conversation. By the time I left her apartment, the tension had softened into a gentle, mutual understanding. The slow-burn desire was still there, palpable, but it was no longer uncertain. We had crossed an invisible line together, acknowledging that our connection was real, meaningful, and worth nurturing. And in that quiet, tender acknowledgement, I felt the first true sense of closeness, not just physical, but emotional, a bond that promised warmth, trust, and intimacy in the days to come. By the time the weekend arrived, the quiet tension between us had shifted into something softer, more certain. I found myself walking up to her apartment with a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just attraction anymore, it was the pull of shared understanding, of a connection built slowly, tenderly, and carefully over time. She greeted me at the door with a smile that held both warmth and mischief, the kind that made the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. Her presence seemed to fill the room effortlessly, yet without overwhelming it. I noticed the subtle curve of her lips, the gentle tilt of her head, the quiet confidence in the way she stood, all the little details I had been noticing for weeks, now charged with new meaning. We settled into the living room, sitting closer than usual, but without the hesitations that had previously defined our proximity. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for a blanket, and this time, I didn't pull back. Our fingers intertwined briefly, the warmth of her touch radiating into me, a grounding, comforting presence. There was a gentle heartbeat in that connection, a rhythm that spoke of trust, tenderness, and a shared acknowledgement of what had been growing quietly between us. She leaned slightly into me, not forcefully, but naturally, allowing the comfort of my presence to meet hers. I could feel the subtle warmth of her shoulder against mine, the soft rise and fall of her breath, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the quiet evening air. Every detail felt magnified, as if the world had slowed to match the intimacy of that moment. Our conversation flowed with ease, punctuated by laughter and the occasional pause that said more than words could. We spoke honestly about loneliness, desire, and the strange ways life sometimes brings people together. There was no rush, no pressure, only a gentle unfolding of connection, the slow-burn romance we had nurtured finally finding its fulfillment. As the evening drew on, we shared a lingering hug, her cheek resting softly against my chest. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the warmth of her body, and the quiet steadiness of trust that had grown between us. It was a touch full of meaning, reassurance, affection, and the acknowledgement of the bond we had built. When I left that night, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a quiet, glowing certainty. The age difference, the hesitation, the slow tension, all of it had led to this moment. Our story had reached its emotional resolution, rich in intimacy and warmth, leaving behind the lingering sweetness of a connection that promised depth, trust, and tenderness for whatever came next. And if you want to see the full story of how our quiet connection grew into something neither of us expected, the full video is waiting, link in the description.